Today's passage, or this sermon, I've entitled "Watch Carefully." Matthew 24 and 25 are about the second coming of Jesus, and the second coming will be a lot different than the first. And so, the first coming, the bit about the angels, that was really prominent, but overall, it was relatively quiet. That there was a star. There were the shepherds, we heard about those, and there's the host of angels, but most people in that area just slept through the first Christmas. They didn't know about it, they didn't bother with it. Some of that was choosing to not bother with it, like the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Is it too loud? You want me to turn it down a little bit? And some of it was just because they didn't bother. But no one will miss the second coming of Jesus. Is this better now? Okay, good, excellent. All right, which I like to call the second Christmas. And so, as we are working through this, we want to keep that first Christmas and second Christmas concept in mind. And unlike the first Christmas, no one will miss the second one. Some will welcome it, some will hate it, but everybody will see it. It will be gloriously obvious. Jesus wants his disciples to be ready. And so he is teaching them about his return in 5 different ways. We've covered a couple of those already. And so in Matthew 24, 3 through 31, he described the events leading up to his return. In Matthew 24, 32 through 51, he tells his disciples that they need to be faithful and wise servants, knowing that the master could return at any point and at any time. Today, he's going to tell his disciples to watch the way a bridal party watches for the bridegroom. Next week, we'll see that he tells his disciples to faithfully manage God's property. And then finally, Jesus will describe the final judgment in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. And so each of these sort of things, it's a different description, but it highlights a different aspect of what it means to be ready for Jesus and watching for Jesus when he returns. And so, for example, that first one he mentioned in Matthew 24, 3 through 31, it highlights that the roots of Jesus' second coming are actually embedded in the Old Testament. It's something that was predicted in lots of different places, but in the book of Daniel in particular. It shows it's preparing the disciples for their future suffering, and Jesus is saying that you're going to suffer, and I want you to know that, and I want you to be ready. And then it's also demonstrating that God is sovereign throughout all of it, that despite that suffering, Jesus will come back and Jesus will win, even if it looks like he isn't going to. So that was Matthew 24, 3 through 31. And then last week in 32 through 51, again, we saw that Jesus is comparing the second coming to a master coming home unexpectedly. It's a little bit like when you're at work and you've got Netflix. I have a colleague, and we have an iPad that we can communicate with the local ambulance service. And so if somebody's having a problem, they can FaceTime with me in the ambulance, and I can see the patient, I can see the paramedic, and we can talk. One of my colleagues downloaded Netflix onto this iPad, which was awkward because my boss is showing off this, it wasn't me, and my boss is showing off the iPad, and he turns it on, and Netflix pops up. That's not what you want your boss to see that you've been doing. At the very least, you want to be working on a sermon for your church, but you don't want to be caught watching Netflix, and you don't want to be caught by the master being unfaithful and unwise. You want to be ready, all right? And then as I said today, in Matthew 25, 1 through 13, Jesus is telling us to watch for the bridegroom as if we were a bridal party. So let's work through this again together. Carrie read it once, but you can't read it too many times. And so 25, 1 through 13 says, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at the midnight there was a cry, 'Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered, saying, 'Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves.' While they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast. And the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you neither know the day nor the hour. We don't know a lot about wedding ceremonies in first century Israel. It seems that part of the tradition was that the groom would start at his house, and there would be sort of a procession from the groom's house to the bride's house. And the groom would then meet up with the bride and her bridal party, and they would proceed back to the groom's house, and that's where they would hold their celebration. And unlike our weddings, which are typically sort of mid to early afternoon, these were typically in the evening. And so it would happen when the sun goes down. And so that kind of makes a little bit of sense why the Bible is talking so much about lamps in this passage. In this story, the bridegroom clearly represents Jesus. Not only is that the most logical interpretation, but Jesus himself calls himself the bridegroom multiple times in the book of Mark and in the book of Luke. And so Jesus is the bridegroom here. And it's funny because his arrival is unpredictable. And so remember last week when Justin was preaching, he arrived early. This week he's going to arrive late. And so it just sort of drives home the point. We don't know when Jesus is coming back. We just need to be ready for it. The 10 virgins are essentially unmarried bridesmaids. And so their job, at minimum, is to provide light for the wedding ceremony. And as such, in this parable, they represent all professing Christians. We need to be careful here. We don't want to get confused. In the book of Ephesians, it talks about Jesus being the bridegroom and the church being the bride. And that is true. That is one of the primary metaphors in describing what we as the church are like. This is a different metaphor in this situation. The church, the all-professing Christians, are the bridesmaids. Some of them are genuine Christians, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. Some of them are fakes. And so 5 of the virgins in this story are wise. 5 are foolish. And all 10 of them fall asleep. And when you're looking at the commentaries, is that a good thing for them to have done or a bad thing for them to have done? And it seems to contradict Jesus' command earlier in Matthew 24:42 that says, be awake and be watchful. These particular virgins, or even the wise ones, they're not rebuked for that. I personally find that somewhat comforting, that it would seem that sleep and being watchful are somehow consistent with one another. So I like that part, particularly after having worked the night before. The bridegroom arrives unexpectedly at midnight. All the virgins wake up. Only 5 are ready. The other 5 trying to cram in all of their preparation into the last moments, but they're too late. The door to the wedding feast is closed, and the groom refuses to let them come in. His rebuke helps us understand the virgins, the foolish virgins in particular, a little bit better. It says, watch therefore, for you know neither, truly I say to you, I do not know you. All right, so keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in a moment. Finally, Jesus interprets the parable for us in Matthew 25:13. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. It's always helpful when Jesus tells you what to focus on in your sermon. And so this was if we had all the lights out, you'd see it better. So the key word is watch, okay? And the picture I have up here was a pair of binoculars that was recovered from the sea next to the Titanic. And so there's a certain irony here that if only somebody had been watching well, it would not have been famous and ended up in a museum somewhere. And so we want to be watchful better than what those things ended up being used for. So in this passage, Jesus wants us to watch as if we're a bridal party waiting for the bridegroom. And the wise virgins did that in at least 3 ways, and we'll be working our way through that in a minute. First, they watched with faithful diligence for the bridegroom. Second, they watched with anticipation for the bridegroom. And then third, they watched with joyful expectation of the bridegroom's wedding feasts. All right, we'll go through that more carefully, but those are the three things that the wise virgins did that made them wise. So first, let's go over some watching with faithful diligence for the bridegroom. Those of you that are married know that preparing for a wedding is a lot of work. I was sort of reminiscing a little bit in my own brain about the things Terry and I had to do to get ready. So you got to get the invitations, design them, and send them, right? So that has to happen early. You have to. Terry had to buy the wedding dress. I had to rent a tuxedo. I had it easy. Terry said, "I like that one." That's the one I rented. It was very simple, much easier than her dress was. We had to order the flowers. The food had to be made. The venue had to be decorated. The photographer has to be hired, the honeymoon has to be planned, and that's just a little bit of the stuff that has to be done as you're getting ready for the wedding day. Terry and I, when we were doing this, we had a big whiteboard on my wall. And so everything that came up, so, we got to do that, and we put that on the list. So if either one of us had like a moment, you'd go to the whiteboard and say, I can do that bit right there. And by God's grace, through some careful planning, but mostly a lot of help from our future in-laws, it all got done, and everything was ready when the day finally arrived. The unmarried bridesmaids in today's parable, it's kind of similar that they had to prepare ahead of time. If we sort of put our imagination hats on, presumably they had to get something nice. They had to wear something nice. And presumably they had to have their hair done. That's always important. And they had to be at the right place at the right time. They couldn't get there a week afterwards. They had to be right there when the bridegroom had told them to be there. And as the parable tells us, most importantly, they had to make sure they brought their lamps. We don't know why they needed lamps. As I said, these things tended to happen in the evening. And so at a bare minimum, presumably they needed lamps in order to provide light for the ceremony. But they may have been something else as well. The kicker with lamps, kids, remember this, they didn't have Duracell batteries then. Okay, and they didn't have an extra stash in the basement like we do in our basement. You needed lots of oil so that you could burn it, and you could burn it for an extended period of time because the oil would burn fairly fast, and so your lamp would only hold 1 or 2 hours worth of oil in it before you had to top it back up again. And so on top of remembering to bring the lamps, they had to remember that to bring their oil. It was part of being faithful and diligent in the instructions they had received from the bridegroom. You got that? So we're watching with faithful diligence. And so the wise virgins were allowed into the wedding feast because they were watching diligently. They had brought enough oil with them, and they were ready when the bridegroom showed up later than expected. The foolish virgins were not allowed into the wedding feast because they were not watching diligently. They had not brought enough oil with them, and they were not ready when the bridegroom arrived. We don't know why. Again, sort of putting our imagination hat back on, you can sort of read between the lines a little bit. It's possible they were too disinterested to care. Pretty predictable you would need oil, but maybe just, whatever, not gonna bother. It's possible they were just too busy with other things to bother. They had a big long list. The easiest thing to get off the list was to not buy the oil. And it's possible that they were just too presumptuous, that they thought, well, you know what, it's not gonna matter anyway, why should I bother? Whatever their reason, they thought they would be fine, and as we see in our parable, unfortunately they're not. Jesus commands us to watch diligently. And so one of the questions as we get to this first point is, what does that mean and how do we do that? So looking at our parable, presumably watching diligently in this parable, sort of being consistent, it means bringing enough oil. Which again, then you end up go to the commentaries and you say, well, what is the oil? And nobody knows what the oil is because Jesus doesn't say what the oil is. My favorite one said, it's just oil. It's the parable. Don't try and sort of make this sort of extra pictures in there. You're going to end up in weird places. It's just oil. We get a clue, though, in Matthew 25, verse 12. So you have your Bible. Take a look at it. I would have expected, so remember the context. The door has been shut. The wise virgins are on the inside. The foolish ones are on the outside. The foolish ones want to get inside. And he says what? He says, I don't know you. I would have expected him to say, you can't come in because you weren't ready. That would have been logically consistent. Or to say, you know what, you were just so foolish, you clearly didn't care much about me, why should I let you into my wedding feast? You didn't bother. He doesn't say either one of those things. He says, you can't come in because I don't know you. So putting those putting those two pieces together in some way, shape, or form, the not having enough oil is somehow equivalent to not knowing Jesus or being known by Jesus. And so at the end of our first point, that's our takeaway message. That we are watching with faithful diligence. We can do a lot of different things. Our last passage last week, remember, we wanted to be faithful and wise servants. We want to be doing what we're supposed to be doing, and that's right and true. But this particular passage, the emphasis is on make sure that you're watching in such a way that you are in right connection with the bridegroom. That you know the bridegroom, and more importantly, the bridegroom knows you, and you will be welcome. So that's point number one, watching with faithful diligence. Point number two, watching with anticipation. I liked that picture. I resonated with dogs with too much skin on them. So anyway, there you go. There are two moments that everybody anticipates in a wedding. At least that was my thought. The first moment is when the bride appears, and the future husband sees his bride coming down the aisle for the first time. When I got married, it was traditional that the groom isn't supposed to see the bride ahead of time. I'm told that's changing. I don't know. But I hadn't seen Terry that day. I'd seen her that night. I hadn't seen her dress. She was very particular about that. And so it was a very big moment for me to see my wife appear at the back, my future wife, appear at the back of the church in her wedding dress with Chuck and descending down the aisle. All right, that was a big moment. The second moment is when after the couple they've said their vows in front of the pastor, and the pastor takes a deep breath and then says those magic words, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Whereas 5 minutes before you were both single and separate, now you're married and you're a couple, you're an entity, and God has bound those two individuals together in marriage vows. So those are sort of the two peak moments that everybody anticipates in a wedding, and it's those things that people are remembering as they are getting ready faithfully and diligently for all of the months beforehand. And so again, the wedding in Matthew 25, 1 through 13, it was similar. The bridegroom was late, but the wise unmarried bridesmaids, the wise virgins, they're still there and they're waiting. They're faithfully anticipating his arrival. They didn't go home. It would have been tempting. I'm sure they would have had a more comfortable place to sleep. He's like, I don't know, you're like 4 hours late, but clearly we're out of here. All right, that would have been tempting. They didn't do that. They waited, and even though they fell asleep, they were still doing what they were needed to be doing, and they were being faithfully diligent. And then he shows up. And then this guy comes in from the street, says, the bridegroom is here. And they all wake up. And those that had been faithful were ready to meet the bridegroom. They had been anticipating his arrival. They were ready for it. And that big moment had finally arrived because the bridegroom was there, and they knew the bridegroom, and the bridegroom knew them. And it wasn't just sort of your average bridegroom. It was Jesus as the bridegroom, which means he's magnificent in every way. And they were anticipating his arrival. And so Jesus commands us to be faithfully diligent, and he commands us to be anticipating his arrival the way a bridal party anticipates the arrival of the groom. I had to think a bit about this one, because it was a new thought for me. And so what does that look like? And so I went into the scriptures. That's always a good place to start. And I said, what does it look like when some of the heroes of the faith were anticipating Jesus and then they got to see him? All right, so here's some examples. Number one, in John 3, 29 through 30, anticipating the arrival of Jesus made John the Baptist rejoice more and focus on himself less. The one who is the bride is the bridegroom. This is John the Baptist speaking. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. All right? So, number one, we see that anticipating the arrival leads to more rejoicing and less focus on ourselves. Then in 1 Peter 1, 3-5, anticipating the arrival of Jesus made Peter overflow with praise. I'm really bad at grammars, but I think these are adjectives. Okay, and I was going to put that in there, but Chuck can correct me later. But look, listen to this. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to his great mercy. He has caused us to be born again to living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead to an inheritance that is, here's the bit that I thought was cool, imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. He's not just sort of like, it'll be a good time. He's like, this is going to be great. It's going to be imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. And then the third example I came across is that anticipating for the arrival of Jesus, waiting for Jesus, makes the angels worship. And this is at the back of the Bible in Revelation 19. Then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. For here's the word, marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. So based on this and other passages in Scripture, I think we can conclude three things. That if we are watching for Jesus, we are anticipating his arrival the way this parable tells us we should, it makes us less easily satisfied with lesser pleasures. Kids, what am I supposed to say here? Because Jesus is better. Excellent. Yay. All right. So because Jesus is better, and watching for Jesus makes us more excited about our salvation, and it makes us more eager to see Jesus face to face. Third thing. So we are watching with diligence. We're watching with anticipation. And now finally, we are watching with joyful expectation of a wedding feast. The wise virgins were eager to see the bridegroom, but the blessing didn't just end with his arrival. They also got to go to the bridegroom's wedding feast. The wedding feast is a metaphor for heaven. Heaven will be the best feast you can imagine. If you sort of think through the analogies people have in heaven, about heaven, there are some weird ones. There's the floating on clouds analogy people sometimes think of. There's the harp concert one. Neither one of those sounds particularly exciting. I hang out with a lot of people at work, and they seem to feel that heaven will be boring, quiet, and serene, and hell will be a wild party. That's a mistake, but that seems to be what some of my friends think. And while we don't really know a lot of details, we do know that heaven will be glorious. Jesus describes his return and the appetizer round of the wedding feast in Revelation 21. So if you have your Bibles again, turn to that also. Someday it would be a really good study for us to work through this in detail. We've done some of this in my GCG in the past, but more detail would be good. And so we'll read through Revelation 21, 1-4, just to try and get the taste. What does that appetizer feel like, and what will it be like? Understanding that it's the appetizer round. It's not the whole wedding feast. It's going to be even better than all the stuff we're going to read here. It's Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. It's hard to know what the word new means, but if you sort of study this and sort of in depth, it seems that sort of the weight of Scripture would suggest that it's not new as in completely different. It's a renewed heaven and creation. And so there will be things that are a lot different, but it will be recognizable. In Isaiah 11, we see that animals will be present. And if animals are present, presumably that means there will be trees and grass and mountains and rivers, and there will still be ecology. Won't that be exciting, Miranda? I wasn't good at ecology either. That was another weakness. So grammar and ecology were my weaknesses. And as we'll see in a minute, there will be at least one city, which we'll read about in a second, but that implies that people will be doing what people normally do in cities. What do they do in cities? Well, they have architecture, and you have art, and you have music and symphony halls, and people do athletics. Whatever they're doing, we know one thing is for certain, though, that everything we do will be perfectly connected to God. We won't just be enjoying it because it just happens to be enjoyable. We'll be enjoying it, and we'll enjoy it so much, and we'll see it's a good gift from God, and it will cause us to look at more than we did already. That's what we'll be doing in heaven. Next verse. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Notice who's there. You have Jesus. Jesus is there. And you have the bride. And as we mentioned in the book of Ephesians, the bride is the church. And Jesus will be there in a physical way. So at the beginning we talked about Christmas. And remember, Jesus is known as Emmanuel. He's God with us. Christmas is the first time Jesus was physically here with his people for an extended period of time. And that's the first Christmas. And so I like to call this the second Christmas, because he will once again be back, and he will be physically present with us in this new city. And then verses 3 and 4, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. So what will the appetizer round be like? It won't be boring. Right up front, we arrive at the wedding feast. We are escorted there by Jesus to the wedding feast. And right up front, God wipes away our tears. No more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. If you read a little further in this passage, you'll see that there will be no more sin. The plan of salvation will be complete. Your adoption as one of his family members will be finalized. The wedding feast isn't just sort of something that's sort of tacked into the parable. The wedding feast will be magnificent because we'll be in a glorious place. We will be physically with Jesus. We will spend eternity loving Jesus and being loved on by Jesus. That's the wedding feast. When I was growing up, people would sometimes say, he's so heavenly minded, he's of no, what's the rest of it? Earthly good. There you go. This may surprise you. It probably won't, because you're a smart group of people. That's not in the Bible. I don't know who made that up. A non-Christian, presumably. It's not in the Bible. Quite the opposite. Heaven is a commanded obsession. Isn't that strange? Because I don't treat it like that. You can look up those verses at some point, and you'll see that is the case. When we watch with joyful expectation of the bridegroom's wedding feast, we are watching for heaven. These verses and others tell us that we find hope and encouragement and strength to carry on. Helps us rise above our current struggles. It kind of helps set them in perspective. In fact, it means that we can even rejoice despite the struggles, and sometimes even because of the struggles, because we know that those struggles are producing in us something very, very good, getting us ready for that wedding feast. And it helps us stay the course, to not give up, and to keep on following Jesus. So it's important. Heaven's a commanded obsession. We are commanded to watch with joyful expectation. So kids, this slide is for you, because we've said a lot of things, and I want to have a slide at the end that says, make sure you remember this bit. All right? So, watching wisely, what does it mean? It means that we are watching with faithful diligence. Remember, that means we are knowing Jesus and we're being known by Jesus. We are watching with anticipation for his arrival, because the bridegroom is awesome. He is worth waiting for. And we are watching with joyful expectation of the wedding feast afterwards. There's a couple of ways you can end a sermon like this. one of the ways is you kind of focus on the foolish virgins and on Jesus' warning in Matthew 25, verse 13. The watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour the bridegroom is returning. And so we need to be ready. And it's really bad if you're not ready. And it's really bad if you end up just sort of not knowing Jesus and being known by Jesus, because if that happens and Jesus comes back, it means that you've wasted your whole life and you don't get to go to the wedding feast. So that's important. However, a wise podcast that I was listening to the other day, we need to look at the passage, but we also need to understand where we are as a congregation. And most of you know Jesus. And most of you aren't, maybe any of you aren't in the foolish virgin category. You do know Jesus, and you are anticipating his arrival, and you are joyfully expecting his return. And so, for us, in this congregation, meeting here tonight, I want to focus on the second way of ending a sermon like this, and that's to focus on the wise virgins. For those who know and are known by Jesus, this passage is tremendously good news. It means Jesus is coming back. We don't know when, but we know that he will, and that someday we'll see him face to face for the first time. Back when I was dating Terry, I was in Michigan, she was in Maryland. We were both in school, and every 4 or 5 weeks or so, I would buy a plane ticket, and I would fly out to Maryland. And it wasn't something I had to do, and it wasn't a sacrifice, because I treasured those few hours with Terry far more than I treasured the $300. And I wanted to see her face to face, even though I could call her anytime I wanted on a cell phone. We racked up a very large cell phone bill. Chuck and Barb probably remember that part. There were a lot of minutes that first month in particular. Seeing Jesus for the first time will be like seeing the person you love most in the world times a million, because Jesus is that precious. I expect that when I finally see Jesus face to face, there will be a fair amount of fear and trembling. That's what I expect. And that might be why one of the first things Jesus has to do is wipe away all the tears from our eyes, because there will be a lot of fear and trembling. And yet, isn't it glorious that that's not the thing that Jesus leaves us with? He takes care of the fear and trembling, and we get to be with him forever, loving him and being loved by him. So this is a tremendously good news passage, because Jesus is coming back. And then it means that Jesus is coming back so you can attend his wedding feast. Revelation 22, 3-5 sort of summarizes it perfectly. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They'll see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. And so we watch. For those of us that know Jesus and are known by Jesus, we don't watch out of fear or because it's just another rule we got to tack on to all those things we're supposed to do, but we don't do very well. We watch because the second coming of Jesus, that second Christmas, is tremendously good news. Again, for those who know Jesus and are known by him. Let's pray. And so, our Heavenly Father, thank you that you made a way for us to know you. Not just know about you, even the devil knows about you, but we can know you in the type of way a bride or a friend or a family member can know someone. And thank you that it's not just one-sided, but you know us. And you will lead us and guide us and care for us. And someday you will come back. And someday we will be able to go to the wedding feast with you and be loved by you and love you in person. And so thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.